Good evening, guys, or morning, or whenever you're watching this. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Salesforce Sandboxes and why you use them, the different types of them. I picked this topic because I've seen this on the Udemy and focus on force tests. A couple questions on each. I figured this is a pretty important topic, and we'll probably see one question, possibly two, maybe, on our Salesforce platform app builder exam. So let's dive right in. And I wanted a fun topic, talking about sandboxes makes me feel like a kid again. So here we go. All right. First off, of course, what are Salesforce sandboxes, right? So basically they're testing environments, right, that are copy and linked to a production org. So they do actually, if you buy whatever, it depends on what edition you buy too, depends on what kind of a sandbox kind of type that you might get. It allows you to develop and test in a safe environment, right? You don't want to make, especially if you got something with hundreds of thousands of customers, right? You don't want to be testing stuff that could break your org or reduce functionality or some kind of error, right? That's embarrassing, makes your company look bad. You could potentially lose customer and your reputation that way. So definitely always want to test everything in a sandbox first. And of course, that's just the best practice to use these sandboxes, right? So when you create a sandbox, only the metadata comes over, but some types of the sandboxes allow you to actually copy over data too, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, which is your records. Right. So the number of sandboxes and types are going to depend on what Salesforce edition, like I said, right? So the full copy sandbox is not available in the enterprise edition of Salesforce. But it is available, though, if you get the unlimited and performance edition. So it's just something to think about. So some of these ones you might have to pay out a little bit extra to get the better sandbox. So I also want to tell you that large organizations, businesses too, will have a number of sandboxes that serve different functions, right? So one could be for development, one could be for testing, one could be for user training. So just keep that in mind too, that not all your production orgs are just going to have one development thing too. Development sandbox. So after testing and test out the change that works and everything, and to move these production orgs, use the change sets. So I'm going to tell you before we dive into the different types of sandboxes, let's talk a little bit about refreshing a sandbox. Right, so what refreshing a sandbox means, basically, after you create one, and let's say you've been using it for a while, but you want to go make some changes. So, it's 3 months later, and you want to make some more changes. So you want to go and refresh your sandbox, right, which basically replaces an existing sandbox with a copy from a new copy of your metadata from production, of course, and some of the data, depending on what type you have. So really is the best practice, right? You want to refresh regularly. If it's been 3-6 months since you've refreshed your sandbox, you start making changes, it's probably not going to reflect what your real production org looks like. So you need to refresh these, and we'll talk about the different types of sandboxes. Can be refreshed at different intervals, time intervals. All right, so I've been hitting about these all the time. Let's go ahead and dive into these different types of sandboxes, and this is probably the meat of the presentation, right? I believe that most of the questions focused around what the different types are and what they're called and things like that. So definitely, if nothing else, just remember this slide here, the different types of sandboxes. So you have a developer sandbox, a developer pro sandbox, a partial copy sandbox, and a full copy sandbox. They're actually named very appropriately too, and you'll see why. So for the developer sandbox, this is what you use for developing new functionality, configuration, code testing. That's what you use for any of these sandboxes. Multiple users can log in. So, all your if you have different admins and people testing and everything, you should always have, the more eyes you got on when you make changes, the better, right? Somebody always can catch something that you might not, or think of a better way to do something. So the developer sandbox is fairly limited, only 200 megabyte files in storage limit. So you can pull over just a small amount of, some records, particularly if you got attachments and stuff too, files you want to run out of space really quickly. Only the metadata can be refreshed, so no data gets pulled over, right? None of your records do, and it's going to be refreshed once a day. So Developer Pro Sandbox is just the same as this, right? It has all the functionality of the Developer Sandbox. Biggest difference is it has 1 gigabyte of data and file storage and record storage. And it can also be refreshed once a day. So you can pull over, basically this one is if you got a larger org and you don't need a huge and don't really need huge amounts of data and stuff to test out your code, this would be the way to go. So next one then we'll talk a little about the newer ones, right? The newer ones are partial copy and full copy sandboxes, right? And they bring a whole lot more functionality over to your sandboxes. So they got 5 gig. This one has 5 gigabytes of file and data storage, right? So you can already see you're moving up just by that. You can also copy data over much easier. You actually use sandbox templates to find a copy of the data that whatever you want. So you can pick whatever objects you want and bring the data over. So up to 10,000 records per copy will be copied per object. The refresh interval is 5 days. And so basically, and this one is cheaper and refreshes more often than the full copy sandbox, which we're going to talk about. So this is the partial copy sandbox. So full copy sandbox is just what you think. It's a full copy of your production org, right? If you don't want to bring over everything, you can always use refresh templates, sandbox templates to select what data you want to bring over. And this is what the bigger organizations are going to use this, right? For UAT, user acceptance training, testing, performance testing, and change functionality, right? Anytime you do this, like I said earlier, if you got millions of customers, thousands of employees, you do not want to be testing things. Maybe even a developer sandbox or a partial copy, right? You're still not going to get the full effects of what some of the changes might do. There's also sometimes if you're just working these developer sandboxes, you make changes, they work fine over there, then you use your change sets or make your changes in your production org and something doesn't work. So that's going to be a lot less likely to happen if you have a full copy, right? Because you're basically running your org over there in the sandbox. So anything you can definitely isolate and troubleshoot problems more often. Because sometimes you got to make 10 changes or something to try to figure out exactly what's going on, especially sometimes with security and stuff like that, right? You don't want to be making all these changes in your production org trying to figure it out, right? And it's kind of just best not to make the problem worse and isolate what the real problem is in your sandbox. So it's really great for troubleshooting as well. So all this power though comes at a cost, right? So you can only refresh every 29 days. And like we said earlier too, it's only your upper tier Salesforce instances that additions that will get this for free at least. And of course, you can pay a little bit extra to get this for the other additions. So anyways, I hope if you have watched this video that you will be able to pass your questions in exam now. So remember, nothing else, remember just go back here and look at your different types of sandboxes, because I'm sure they'll probably try to trick you and throw some other names on there that you're not familiar with. All right, you guys have a good evening or morning and day, and glad you took the time to watch this video. I'll talk to you later.